This is how I eliminated my client's ADHD symptoms in only 67 days. So here we go. So to give you context of my client, this is Greg. And when he first came to me, he struggled many years with his ADHD, and he was a construction worker and he was running a company. So he owned this company and he had severe digestive issues. He had decreased energy, like drastic. He'd show up to work really late. And he also was starting to lose his memory. His employees also really noticed that his focus was way off and he would forget things, very important things. And this was getting to a point where not only was it stressing at work, it also was impacting his marriage. And so I'm going to take you from the very beginning to the very end of everything that I did with him to eliminate his ADHD symptoms that he was experiencing. And so the very first thing that I always want to look at when it comes to someone's ADHD is look at all the other possibility health issues that an individual might have that can contribute to their ADHD symptoms. So since Greg was dealing with focus, low energy, and he was also dealing with some digestive issues. So I first want to, of course, address the gut and see, okay, is there some issues going on here? Because a lot of our neurotransmitters are made in the gut. And so we want to make sure that's working properly. And so the first thing that I tested for was his stomach acid, and his pH levels were at 5.5. And so that is actually really low. Just to kind of give you context, you want to see your pH levels anywhere from 6.0 to 6.4. Otherwise, you're not breaking down and digesting your foods properly. And so that can cause issues down the road of getting the proper nutrients that you need, not only for your body, but also for your brain. The other things that also were an issue is that his blood pressure was definitely high. He was definitely dealing with hypertension. He wasn't really taking anything for it. And that can cause some issues, especially because he was dealing with high stress, and that can cause detriment not only to your cardiovascular health, but also can cause other issues down the road, poor circulation, because his blood sugar levels were also really high. They were 122 milligrams per deciliter. Now that is pretty much what I would consider more kind of pre-diabetic. I like to see it between 90 and 99 after a couple hours after eating. So this was definitely an impact to his ADHD, because when you have ups and downs in your blood sugar levels, it's also going to drastically cause some issues. The other thing also we tested for and saw that his liver enzymes were elevated. And so this can cause concern of fatty liver disease down the road. The liver does a lot for us, and this can cause symptoms of brain fog and fatigue like he was experiencing. He also had elevated cholesterol and also triglycerides. So when I saw this, the very first part of the treatment plan that I decided to do and implement with him is, we need to take care of this first and foremost, is getting his stomach acidity back in balance. And so one thing that I do like incorporating is organically bound minerals. This is a great alkalizer to help kind of balance things where it needs to be. You can also use magnesium oxide, because that is an alkalizing type of magnesium that can help bring the pH in that nice healthy 6.0 to also 6.4 range. And once he implemented this pretty quickly, within just like about a week, he wasn't dealing with the gassing and bloating. He wasn't having the abdominal pain, which that's huge, because that was definitely a detriment to his health that was causing other issues within his ADHD. I also incorporated pancreatic enzymes, which also does help with breaking down your fats, proteins, and also carbs. And so that's really important to incorporate. And then of course I added hawthorn extract to bring down his blood pressure levels. And that did help start bringing that down to a more healthier range. And then I add blood sugar support, which has berberine in it and a few other things that are really effective in helping with someone who is pre-diabetic, like how Greg was. And so therefore this made a drastic improvement in stabilizing his blood sugar. And he started to notice that he had a little bit more consistency with his energy and his focus. And then I also added Livoplex to really help combat the elevated liver enzymes, as well as the elevated cholesterol and also triglycerides. We also incorporated things such as like intermittent fasting, because that's a really effective way of starting to reverse these things, especially with also the high blood pressure. And so he started to implement some intermittent fasting. So I first started him off doing the 16-8, where it's 16 hours a day and then eating in an 8-hour window frame. And then I moved him towards once a week, where he would do a 24 to 36 hour fast. And then he started to notice, not only was he starting to kind of like losing weight, but he also noticed that his blood pressure was getting to that more healthier range, as well as his triglyceride levels and his cholesterol and his liver enzymes got back into the healthy reference ranges. So that was like a big thing, because once we started changing those things, he started to notice that his health was back on track, but he still was dealing issues with the focus, a little bit of low energy. So it wasn't quite there. And so I knew I had to do some other things that to incorporate. So I did incorporate lots of different foods that I knew were really important based off of the testing that we initially already did. And that was to really eliminate a lot of the greasy oil fried foods from his diet, even like the high fatty dairy products, especially like cheese, creams, butter, even like coconut, things that were a little bit more harder to digest. I had to start eliminating those things because his body was in a state where it was pretty much like a slow oxidizer where it doesn't break down energy very well. And so we had to kind of switch up his diet in that capacity. We also need to eliminate a lot of the different sugars of all different types, also starchy whites. That was also really important to eliminate on top of that. And then, of course, things that are more inflammatory, such as like beer, wine, eliminate those alcohols. And then the things that we needed to incorporate more for was obviously vegetables was going to be a big one. And so I had him incorporate that more into his diet. Healthy starches of all types, whole grains, beans, roots, and squashes. And then lean proteins. He wasn't getting enough proteins in his diet, which is very vital for people with ADHD, but he needed to do more lean proteins that weren't high in fat. So grass-fed beef, chicken, fish, stuff like that. And then healthy fats was another thing that I wanted him to focus on. Things like walnuts, pumpkin seeds, nut butters, olive oil, avocados, and fish oils and stuff like that. And then seasonal vegetables, I had him keep that in between about 1 to 2 servings a day. And then overall, like the main thing that I wanted him to look at was within his healthy plate was to focus on getting about 60% of his healthy plate to being green leafy vegetables. And then about 30% of healthy starches, and then about 10% or less was proteins and healthy fats. So he started to really dial this down because supplements are great initially, but we really need to use food as medicine, lifestyle changes, and that's really what's going to help with the consistency. And you'll see here in a minute how that made a big difference for him. And so another thing that I want to also make sure that we were not missing is the other parts that could be contributing to his low energy, his focus issues, and his mood changes that he was experiencing. And so here I decided to test his cortisol levels to see what was going on here, especially with his adrenal function. And you could see here that definitely his cortisol levels were drastically low throughout the entire day, which made a whole lot of sense of why he was late at work every day. He didn't have the energy. He didn't have the focus. He didn't have the motivation and drive. And his employees were like, what's up, man? Like, what's going on? What happened to our boss? And he just wasn't in it. And then also when you get home, he wouldn't be present. So he was having issues with his marriage. And so this was a huge detriment to him. Anytime I do see this, I know we have to understand that people, especially because he was in his mid-50s, so adults with ADHD are always going to have bigger issues when it comes to burnout. And so usually it has a lot to do with the adrenal function. It's what we call as adrenal insufficiency syndrome. And so that is something that needs to be addressed. So what I incorporated here is something called Drenamine. It has some adrenal desiccation in it. It's different from adrenal desiccated. It's a little bit lower dose than some of the other ones because he has high blood pressure. So you have to be careful here. And this one is really good for someone who has high blood pressure. And so I had him incorporate that very first thing in the morning and then in the afternoon, kind of like the mid-afternoon. And that's what I had him do in those 2 times. So as soon as he started to incorporate that, he noticed a drastic improvement in his energy and as well as with his stress levels. But also the other thing that I noticed is that his estradiol levels and his DHEA levels were elevated. And this is very typical when we do see cortisol levels either low or too high, we might see a little spike in this. Now, they weren't drastically elevated. And so that's why I didn't make too much concern because I knew if we actually addressed the adrenals, this would help combat this issue, which it did. And so the other thing that also I had to look into is, okay, is there different neurotransmitters and amino acids that could be off that have not been addressed? And most certainly there was. In fact, this is probably one of the first times I've seen someone have all these levels being so low, as you can see here. Every single one of his amino acids, such as like tyrosine here, as you can see, was low. Phenylethylamine, tyramine, his dopamine levels low. I mean, all of them, norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin, GABA, all those different neurotransmitters, glycine, histamine. I mean, they're all low. And so it's like, no wonder why he felt the way he did is because all his levels were just low and he couldn't function. So when this happens, the thing that I decided, okay, we definitely need to do some drastic improvements here as we're improving the foods, but we need to use something initially just to get things going and using different amino acids and supplementation to help improve that. So clearly, obviously adding phenylethylalanine. So I added D-L-phenylalanine, which is the amino acid that directly does help with improving that. Also, on top of that, to improve tyrosine and dopamine and also norepinephrine, I added DopaBoost, which has both PA in it, as well as N-acetyltyrosine, as well as L-Dopa in it. So that's why I incorporated that. And then the other thing I wanted to incorporate was L-theanine, because L-theanine is really great for not only for dopamine, norepinephrine, but also for serotonin and also GABA, which clearly he was low in all three of those. And then it was important to incorporate tryptophan, because tryptophan can also directly help with improving serotonin levels right here, as you can see where he was low for sure. So we definitely wanted to make sure we are addressing that. The other thing that I wanted to incorporate was rhodiola, because rhodiola is another great one that you can use to help with also serotonin and dopamine. So that was another one that it was good to incorporate. And then on top of that, adding L-glutamine as well as glycine powder, because his glutamate levels were low and his glycine levels were low. And why that's important is because both of those are very vital amino acids to help build a lot of these different neurotransmitters. Now, one other thing that also was low that was important to address was his histamine. So histamine, a lot of people think about like itchy red eyes and, the allergies that you get, what the reaction. Now, it's also important to have a healthy balance. You don't want it to be too low, because histamine is actually used to drive and build and modulate different neurotransmitters. So we added L-histidine to improve that as well. So the other thing that needed to be addressed was certain amino acids that we also did see deficient with him. And so the things that we saw that were very deficient were, for example, was selenium. Now, selenium is important for the thyroid function. So this can be a reason why he probably was also dealing with some low energy. And so instead of just giving him a supplement, I actually had him take Brazil nuts, because Brazil nuts have a lot of selenium in it. And so that's what I had him do, because I didn't want him to take just a bunch of different supplements, even though he already was. And then on top of that, he had low levels of zinc and copper. Now, both of these definitely can make a big impact on building and modulating different neurotransmitters. And so I had him just temporarily supplement zinc and copper at 2 different times of the day, because they really do like to combat from each other. And so that's what I did, incorporating that. So once we started to address all these things, he started to notice big changes. And within 67 days, he literally had like no more symptoms. He said it was like a night and day difference. He had more energy. His digestion improved drastically. His memory was sharp again. He was back on his A game. He was more productive, and he felt his younger self again. He felt like, his ADHD, all his ADHD symptoms were gone. And his employees, that was probably the biggest thing, is his employees and also even his wife noticed the difference. And I think that's when you know that things have changed, when somebody who you love or who you work with actually notice it and not just yourself, that makes all the big difference right there. Now, the thing is I do this a lot with patients and clients, and this is very specific to Greg, and it really requires more individualized treatment to understand how to actually eliminate your ADHD symptoms. So you should watch this video next, where I actually talk about how to eliminate your ADHD symptoms, the 3-step process that I use with all my patients and clients. So watch this video next.